rise. Tonight we journey back to the muddy streets and smoke-filled nights of ancient Cahokia, a place most people imagine as some peaceful lost civilization where noble villagers lived happily beneath giant earthen pyramids, while birds drifted lazily over the Mississippi River. But the truth was far filthier, louder, itchier, smellier, and much more exhausting than most history books ever admit. Because living in Cahokia did not mean relaxing beside nature with spiritual wisdom and fresh air. It meant mosquitoes thick enough to darken the sunset, endless labor beneath crushing humidity, suspicious neighbors listening through reed walls, dangerous food shortages, strange ceremonies in the darkness, polluted water crawling with disease, and thousands of people packed together in conditions that could turn miserable very quickly. So before you settle in tonight, maybe light a small candle. Make sure your roof is not leaking river mud onto your sleeping mat, and prepare to survive one ordinary week inside the largest city north of Mexico, nearly 1,000 years ago. The first thing that would have struck you about Cahokia was the noise. Modern people often picture ancient settlements as strangely silent places filled with wind and birdsong. But Cahokia was enormous for its time. At its height, tens of thousands of people crowded into the settlement and the surrounding districts. The city never truly slept. Even before sunrise, you would hear wood being chopped, dogs barking at strangers, traders shouting across pathways, bobbies crying, and workers dragging heavy loads through mud still wet from last night's rain. Smoke from hundreds of cooking fires drifted low through the air, mixing with the smell of fish, sweat, damp earth, and rotting garbage tossed beyond household fences. You were born here, unfortunately, inside a cramped house made from wooden poles woven together with river cane and plastered with thick clay. In winter, the walls trapped smoke badly enough to make your eyes burn constantly. In summer, the heat transformed the house into a clay oven full of insects. Your sleeping mat rested beside your younger brothers, your aunt, and occasionally a visiting cousin who snored like an injured bear. Privacy barely existed. Every argument became public knowledge within hours. Your mother woke you before dawn because today was another Labor Day connected to the great mound projects rising over the city. The rulers of Cahokia demanded enormous public construction efforts. Massive earth pyramids towered above the settlement, including the gigantic structure modern archaeologists call Monk's Mound. Building these monuments required endless baskets of soil carried by human backs under brutal weather conditions. Thousands of workers hauled dirt day after day, while overseers watched carefully. Breakfast was not exciting. You ate a thin corn porridge that tasted faintly smoky from the cooking pot. Corn kept the city alive, but depending so heavily on maize also caused problems nobody understood yet. Teeth rotted badly. Nutrition became uneven. Some people suffered weakness and illness despite eating constantly. But there were few alternatives when so many mouths needed feeding. As you stepped outside, the humidity already wrapped around your body like a wet blanket. Mosquitoes hovered everywhere near standing water. They attacked exposed skin immediately. People slapped themselves so often it became almost rhythmic. The insects carried sickness too, though nobody understood why fever spread so mysteriously through certain neighborhoods. The streets were not proper roads in the modern sense. Most were packed earth pathways churned into mud whenever storms rolled through. Waste collected in low areas. Chickens scratched near puddles where children played barefoot. Dogs fought over discarded fish bones. The smell could become overwhelming during hot months, especially near crowded residential zones. You joined a line of workers moving toward the central mound district. Towering above everything stood the Great Pyramid itself, an artificial mountain dominating the horizon. Seeing it every day never made it less intimidating. The elite rulers lived near these sacred spaces, separated from ordinary people by status, ceremony, and power. They claimed spiritual authority connected to the heavens themselves. Whether you believed them hardly mattered. Your job today involved carrying soil from one location to another, using heavy woven baskets strapped across your shoulders. It sounded simple until you realized the labor continued hour after hour beneath merciless sunlight. The soil was damp and heavy. The baskets cut into your skin. Mud coated your legs. Supervisors barked instructions constantly, while priests occasionally appeared nearby performing rituals meant to bless the construction. Nobody worked leisurely. Cahokia depended upon organized labor to maintain its monuments, defensive structures, and political authority. If the leadership appeared weak, unrest could spread quickly among the crowded population. Rumors already circulated about food shortages in smaller farming villages outside the city. Around midday, you stopped briefly for water, though clean would not describe it. The city's rapid growth created terrible sanitation problems. Waste seeped into local water sources. Illness spread easily among dense populations living close together. Some seasons brought waves of stomach sickness, so severe entire households became too weak to work. An older laborer beside you coughed constantly into his arm. His teeth were worn down badly from years of gritty cornmeal. He warned quietly that another child from his neighborhood had died during the previous night after a fever. Nobody acted shocked. Death visited frequently here. Infants, especially, rarely survived long. After the short rest, work resumed immediately. The sun climbed higher. Sweat poured down your back until your clothing stuck to your skin like wet bark. Workers stumbled occasionally from exhaustion. If someone collapsed completely, others dragged them aside while labor continued around them. Monument building did not pause for individual suffering. By late afternoon, thunderheads gathered across the horizon. Storms near the Mississippi Valley could become terrifyingly violent. Everyone hurried faster, desperate to finish before the rain arrived. Wind swept across across the fields outside the city, carrying the smell of wet vegetation and river water. Then the storm struck. Rain crashed onto Cahokia with astonishing force. Pathways instantly transformed into rivers of slippery mud. Water poured from rooftops. Workers shouted while scrambling down mound slopes, carrying tools and baskets. Lightning cracked above the pyramids, illuminating the massive structures in blinding white flashes. For a moment, the city looked less like a human settlement and more like something alive beneath the storm clouds. You ran home through ankle-deep mud, while cold rain soaked your clothing completely. Families crowded beneath leaking roofs, trying desperately to keep cooking fires alive. Inside your house, water dripped steadily from one corner onto storage baskets containing precious corn supplies. Your mother cursed softly while moving everything farther from the leak. Dinner consisted of smoked fish and more maize. The fish smelled slightly questionable, but nobody wasted food. Outside, thunder continued rumbling through the darkness, while insects swarmed around standing puddles left by the storm. Then came the drums. Deep, rhythmic pounding echoed from the ceremonial district beyond the houses. Everyone paused. Ceremonies at night were not unusual in Cahokia, but they always carried an unsettling atmosphere. Priests and elite leaders organized elaborate rituals tied to religion, politics, astronomy, and social control. Ordinary people rarely knew exactly what happened during every sacred event. Your younger brother whispered nervously that human sacrifices sometimes occurred near the Great Mound. You told him to stop talking nonsense, though secretly you were not entirely certain he was wrong. Strange stories circulated constantly in crowded cities. Some claimed prisoners were killed during important ceremonies. Others insisted chosen attendants were buried beside powerful leaders after death. The drums continued for hours. Sleep came badly. Your mat felt damp from the storm humidity. Mosquitoes whined endlessly near your ears. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried without stopping. Dogs barked suddenly in the distance before falling silent again. Sometime during the night, you woke because people outside were shouting. At first, you assumed another storm had damaged houses, but then you heard running footsteps and frightened voices. Your father pushed aside the reed doorway and peered outside cautiously. Orange light flickered across the darkness. Fire, one of the nearby structures, had erupted into flames. That was another hidden misery of life in Cahokia. Houses stood close together and were built from highly flammable materials. Once a serious fire began, entire neighborhoods could vanish rapidly. People rushed carrying water baskets while sparks swirled upward into the night sky. Smoke rolled through the settlement, thick enough to choke. You joined others trying desperately to stop the flames spreading farther. Heat blasted against your face. Children screamed while families dragged possessions into open spaces away from danger. Burning reeds crackled loudly as part of the roof collapsed inward. By dawn, the fire was finally controlled, but several homes were destroyed completely. One elderly woman sat in the mud, staring silently at the ashes where her belongings had stood only hours earlier. Nobody had time to comfort her for long. The city continued moving. Workers still marched toward the mounds. Traders still unloaded goods. Priests still prepared ceremonies. Life in Cahokia allowed little pause for grief because survival itself required constant effort. Every season carried new hardships: floods, droughts, disease, insects, labor demands, political tension, food pressure, fire, and exhausting overcrowding, all pressed against daily existence. And worst of all, though you could not yet realize it, the greatness of Cahokia was already beginning to crack beneath the surface. The harvests had started becoming less reliable. The forests surrounding the city were shrinking rapidly from endless woodcutting. Game animals grew scarcer every year. Powerful families competed more aggressively for influence, and the river itself, which gave life to the city, could also destroy it without warning. But those troubles belonged to the future. For now, another miserable morning waited outside your smoke-darkened house as the giant city groaned awake beside the Mississippi once again. Morning arrived not with peace, but with the smell of wet ash drifting through the neighborhood. Thin smoke still curled upward from the burned homes nearby, mixing with the damp river fog creeping across Cahokia. You barely slept after the fire. Your eyes felt gritty. Your back ached from hauling water through the night, and mosquitoes had feasted happily on every exposed inch of skin while you tried unsuccessfully to rest. Yet nobody in the household asked whether you were tired. Exhaustion was simply part of existing here. Your mother handed you another bowl of maize porridge, thinner than usual because supplies needed stretching, until the next delivery arrived from farming villages outside the city. She muttered quietly that traders had been complaining about poor harvests upriver. The weather had become unpredictable lately. Some fields drowned beneath floods, while others dried beneath scorching heat. Nobody agreed on why it was happening. Priests blamed spiritual imbalance. Farmers blamed the river. Elders blamed the growing size of the city itself. Your father blamed the rulers. Of course, he only whispered that indoors. Speaking openly against Cahokia's elite could become dangerous very quickly. The city's leaders controlled labor, ceremonies, trade, and food storage. Their authority rested partly on religion and partly on fear. Everyone understood that without strong leadership, the massive settlement might collapse into chaos. Yet many ordinary people quietly resented how much labor was demanded from them, while the wealthy lived atop the central ceremonial district near the enormous mounds. Outside, workers already crowded the muddy pathways. The burned section of the neighborhood looked miserable in daylight. Charred support beams stuck upward like blackened ribs. A dog sniffed through the ashes, searching for scraps, while families attempted to salvage whatever survived. One woman cried after discovering her stored corn had spoiled from smoke and water damage. Losing food reserves could become a death sentence during difficult seasons. You headed toward the market district, carrying several woven baskets your mother hoped to trade for dried fish or beans. The market was one of the few places in Cahokia that briefly distracted people from the misery surrounding them. Traders arrived from astonishing distances, bringing shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from northern regions, stone tools, animal hides, pottery, and strange stories from beyond the river valleys. Even so, the marketplace was hardly pleasant. The ground squished beneath layers of old mud, food waste, broken pottery, and animal droppings. Smoke from cooking fires hung low beneath the humid morning air. Flies buzzed constantly around meat stalls. People argued loudly over trade values, while children darted recklessly through crowded walkways. A traveling trader displayed beautifully carved ornaments beside necklaces made from marine shells that must have journeyed hundreds of miles to reach Cahokia. For a brief moment, you admired how powerful the city truly was. So many trade routes connected here that goods flowed from distant lands ordinary villagers would never see. Then you noticed the trader himself. He looked sick. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and his hands shook slightly while handling merchandise. He coughed into a cloth repeatedly. Nearby buyers stepped farther away without commenting. Everyone feared sickness in crowded settlements. Disease spread through Cahokia frighteningly fast. Once fever entered a district, entire households sometimes disappeared within weeks. You traded the baskets for smoked fish and a small sack of beans before hurrying away from the coughing merchant. Near the center of the market, a group had gathered around a storyteller describing a recent journey southward. He claimed entire villages near certain rivers had been abandoned after repeated crop failures. Some listeners laughed dismissively, but others exchanged nervous glances. Food insecurity haunted everyone in Cahokia because the population had grown enormous. Feeding such a vast settlement required constant agricultural success. A few bad harvests could create disaster. As you listened, a sudden commotion erupted nearby. Two men were fighting. At first, it looked like an ordinary argument over trade goods, but the situation escalated rapidly. One man shoved the other into the mud. The second grabbed a wooden tool and swung wildly. People scattered backward, shouting warnings. Violence in Cahokia was more common than outsiders might imagine. Thousands of stressed, exhausted people packed closely together created tension constantly. Theft, disputes, jealousy, and drunkenness sometimes exploded into bloodshed. Before the fight worsened further, several guards pushed through the crowd carrying heavy clubs. Their arrival silenced everyone immediately. Cahokia's rulers enforced order aggressively inside the central districts. One guard struck the armed man across the shoulder hard enough to drop him into the mud screaming. The other fighter received similar treatment moments later. No trial followed, No discussion. The guards dragged both men away, while the market quietly resumed activity as though nothing unusual had occurred. That frightened you more than the violence itself. You returned home briefly before midday, only to discover your father preparing tools for another work assignment near the riverbanks. Seasonal flooding had damaged important wooden structures used for transport and storage. Repairs needed completion quickly before heavier rains arrived. He ordered you to come along. The journey toward the river revealed another unpleasant side of life in Cahokia. The farther you moved from the ceremonial center, the more obvious the city's environmental damage became. Forests near the settlement had been heavily cut for construction wood and fire fuel. Tree stumps covered large sections of land that once provided shade and wildlife. Without stable roots holding soil together, erosion worsened after storms. Mudslides occasionally damaged homes built near unstable ground. The river itself looked powerful and unsettling beneath gray clouds. Massive tree trunks drifted through the water from distant regions upstream. The Mississippi brought life, trade, and food to Cahokia, but it also carried danger constantly lurking at the edge of the city. Workers repaired damaged embankments using logs, packed earth, and woven barriers. The labor was miserable. Thick mud swallowed your feet with every step. Swarms of insects hovered above the wet ground. The river smell mixed with sweat until breathing itself felt unpleasant. Nearby, an older worker suddenly shouted. Everyone turned toward the shoreline. Something pale floated against the reeds. At first, you thought it was driftwood. Then the current rolled the object partially over. A body. The corpse belonged to a young man swollen from days in the water. Nobody recognized him immediately. River deaths were tragically common. Drowning accidents, floods, violence, disease, and travel disasters claimed countless lives each year. Workers pulled the body ashore using long poles, while others muttered protective prayers beneath their breath. One laborer insisted the dead man came from an outlying farming village, abandoned after starvation. Another claimed he was a criminal executed upstream. A third quietly whispered that the spirits were angry with Cahokia. Nobody liked that explanation. The body was eventually carried away, wrapped in rough cloth. But the mood along the river shifted afterward. Conversations became quieter. Workers glanced uneasily toward the dark water flowing endlessly southward. By late afternoon, heavy heat returned after the morning clouds vanished. The humidity became unbearable. Sweat soaked your clothing completely, while mud dried into cracked layers across your legs. A younger worker collapsed nearby from exhaustion and heat. Supervisors poured water onto his face before ordering him back to work after only a short rest. The city demanded productivity, regardless of suffering. As sunset approached, you and your father finally headed home through crowded residential districts. Smoke rose from hundreds of evening cooking fires. Somewhere drums echoed faintly again from the ceremonial center. Dogs barked from fenced yards, while children chased each other through muddy lanes despite parents yelling warnings. Then you noticed something unusual. A group of strangers entering the city. They wore different clothing styles from local villagers and carried very few belongings. Their expressions looked exhausted and wary. More migrants had been arriving lately from smaller settlements across the region. Some came seeking opportunity within the great city. Others arrived because their own communities were failing. But Cahokia was already overcrowded. More people meant more pressure on food, housing, sanitation, and political stability. Your father watched the newcomers silently before muttering, "Too many mouths now." That night, your household shared the smoked fish from the market. The flavor had turned slightly sour already, though nobody complained. Outside, summer insects screamed loudly from the wetlands surrounding the city. Then your aunt began telling stories. She spoke about earlier generations when Cahokia was smaller and supposedly easier to live in. Fewer people, more forests, cleaner water, better hunting, less labor demanded by elites. Your father snorted skeptically. Old people always imagined the past was kinder, he said. But your aunt shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "Something feels wrong now." Nobody answered her, because secretly, everyone felt it too. The city still looked powerful from a distance. The giant mounds still rose proudly over the landscape. Traders still arrived from faraway regions. Ceremonies still filled the sacred plazas with music and firelight. Yet beneath the greatness, strain spread through everything. The fields struggled, the forests vanished, disease lingered, tension simmered between ordinary workers and powerful elites. And somewhere beyond the darkness surrounding Cahokia, colder winters and harsher seasons were beginning to gather. You lay awake long after the others slept, listening to the strange, restless sounds of the enormous city breathing around you. Coughing from a neighboring house, distant drums near the mounds, frogs croaking from the wetlands, arguments murmured through thin reed walls, and far away beneath the moonlight, the endless river moving silently past the sleeping city like something ancient that would one day outlast all of it. The next morning began with screaming, not the kind caused by fire or fighting, but sharp, panicked cries coming from somewhere deeper inside the residential district of Cahokia. People emerged from houses immediately, some still half asleep, others clutching tools as though expecting violence. In Cahokia, danger rarely announced itself politely. You stepped outside into the sticky dawn air and saw neighbors gathering near a narrow, muddy lane beside the storage huts. A child had disappeared during the night. The boy was only 6 years old. His mother stood in the mud, weeping uncontrollably, while relatives searched nearby structures with growing desperation. Some believed he wandered away after dark. Others whispered about kidnappers, which terrified everyone far more. Large, crowded cities always attracted ugly rumors. Stories spread about criminals stealing food, raiding homes, or attacking travelers along isolated paths outside the settlement. Within minutes, search groups formed across the neighborhood. Your father joined one heading toward the wetlands near the riverbank. You followed beside him, carrying a wooden spear, mostly intended for animals, though it offered little comfort. Morning fog drifted low across the marshy ground beyond the houses. Mosquitoes swarmed in maddening clouds around every puddle left from recent storms. The wetlands surrounding Cahokia were beautiful from a distance, but miserable once you entered them. Mud sucked greedily at your feet. Hidden insects bit constantly. Thick reeds blocked visibility in every direction. Worse still, dangerous animals occasionally wandered close to the city. Wolves prowled at night. Venomous snakes hid near water. Some elders even claimed enormous cats sometimes stalked isolated hunting paths. Workers and relatives shouted the boy's name repeatedly while moving through the reeds. Hours passed. Then someone found footprints. Small barefoot tracks led toward an overgrown drainage channel where stagnant water collected beneath thick vegetation. Everyone hurried there nervously. Your stomach tightened as the reeds parted ahead. The child was alive. Barely. He sat trembling beside the muddy bank covered in insect bites, dehydrated, terrified, and too exhausted to cry anymore. Apparently, he had wandered away after following a dog during the night and became hopelessly lost in darkness. Relief swept through the searchers immediately. His mother collapsed sobbing when they carried him home, but even this happy ending revealed something grim about life in Cahokia. Children vanished easily here. The city was enormous, chaotic, crowded, and dangerous. A single wrong turn at night could lead someone into wetlands, unfamiliar districts, criminal encounters, or the river itself. Parents constantly feared losing children among the endless activity and confusion. After the search ended, there was little time left for relief because another work assignment awaited. Today involved transporting timber from remaining forest areas north of the city. The journey itself showed how much Cahokia had already consumed the surrounding environment. Years earlier, thick forests supposedly covered vast stretches around the settlement. Now many nearby sections had been stripped almost bare. Construction required endless wood for houses, defensive walls, cooking fires, tools, ceremonial structures, and mound reinforcements. The larger the city grew, the farther workers traveled searching for usable timber. Your group moved through humid woodland, carrying stone axes and rope bundles. Sweat formed almost immediately beneath the heavy morning heat. Insects screamed loudly from the trees overhead, while distant birds scattered deeper into the forest. One older laborer pointed toward freshly cut stumps lining the trail. "Soon there'll be nothing left close enough to carry," he muttered. Nobody argued. Even the air inside the remaining woods felt different now. Less alive somehow. Hunting had become increasingly difficult because animals retreated farther from the growing city every year. Deer sightings were rarer. Smaller game disappeared near populated districts entirely. Some families now depended almost completely on maize because reliable hunting no longer existed nearby. By midday, the workers began chopping trees selected by supervisors. The labor quickly became brutal. Stone axes required enormous effort compared to metal blades unknown in this region at the time. Each strike sent vibrations through your arms, while humidity drained energy relentlessly. Wood chips stuck to sweaty skin. Gnats hovered around faces and eyes constantly. Nearby, two workers argued quietly about food. One insisted elite storehouses contained plenty of reserves, while ordinary people struggled increasingly during poor harvests. Another warned him not to speak too loudly. Complaints about leadership had become more common lately, but openly criticizing Cahokia's rulers remained dangerous. Then something strange happened. A horn sounded from the direction of the city. Everyone stopped working immediately. Another horn followed moments later. The labor supervisor frowned uneasily before ordering the group to return at once. As you approached Cahokia again, tension became obvious. People crowded along pathways, staring toward the ceremonial district. Guards moved quickly through the streets, carrying clubs and spears. Women pulled children indoors. Traders abandoned stalls halfway through business. At first, nobody explained anything clearly. Then rumors spread. A sacred marker near the central mound had been damaged during the previous night. Some claimed drunken vandals caused it. Others whispered something far worse, that rival factions inside the elite leadership were secretly fighting for power. The city suddenly felt different, uneasy, like everyone sensed invisible cracks spreading beneath the surface. Your father kept his head lowered while walking through the crowded streets. "Don't stare," he warned quietly, but it was impossible not to look. Near the central plaza, priests conducted urgent ceremonies beside smoking fires, while guards blocked certain pathways entirely. Drums echoed steadily across the district, not celebratory this time, but harsh and rhythmic, like warning signals. People whispered nervously in clusters outside nearby houses. Cahokia depended heavily on spiritual authority. The rulers connected themselves to celestial events, sacred symbols, and divine favor. If ordinary citizens began believing the gods no longer protected the leadership, unrest could spread rapidly through such a massive population. And recently, too many bad signs kept appearing. Flooding, crop failures, disease outbreaks, fires, food shortages, now damage to a sacred object. Fear moved through the city faster than any messenger. That evening, the atmosphere inside your neighborhood felt tense and suspicious. Families spoke quietly indoors. Even children played less loudly than usual. Everyone sensed something shifting beneath everyday life. Your aunt prepared dinner while muttering prayers under her breath. The meal tasted bland and unsatisfying, mostly maize again, with only a few beans remaining from yesterday's trade. Hunger lingered constantly now. Not full starvation yet, but the uncomfortable awareness that food supplies no longer felt secure. After eating, your father finally spoke openly for the first time in weeks. "The city is becoming too large," he said quietly. Your mother glanced nervously toward the doorway before replying. "Keep your voice down." But he continued anyway. "They keep building mounds while the forests vanish. They demand labor while people grow weaker. They say the spirits bless the city, yet every season brings worse trouble." Nobody answered immediately, because everyone knew he was saying things many secretly believed. Outside, night settled heavily across Cahokia. Humid darkness wrapped around the houses, while distant fires flickered near the ceremonial district. Somewhere dogs barked furiously before suddenly falling silent. Then came another sound. Crying, not nearby this time, farther away. A long, sorrowful wail, drifting through the darkness from another neighborhood entirely. Someone else had died. Your younger brother pulled his sleeping mat closer to the wall uneasily. Death had become so common that people rarely asked detailed questions anymore. Fever, infected wounds, spoiled food, accidents, violence, childbirth complications. The causes hardly mattered. Life expectancy here was brutally short. Later that night, rain began falling softly against the roof. At first, the sound felt calming after the suffocating heat of the day. Cool air drifted through small gaps in the walls. People nearby gradually settled into exhausted sleep. Then thunder rolled across the horizon. The storm intensified rapidly. Wind rattled the walls hard enough to shake loose dust from the ceiling beams. Rain hammered the roof in deafening waves. Lightning flashed through cracks in the house, illuminating frightened faces for brief white moments. Your father suddenly stood. Water was entering beneath the rear wall. Everyone scrambled to move food baskets and sleeping mats away from the spreading floodwater seeping through the clay floor. Outside, people shouted over the storm as runoff rushed through the streets like small rivers. Then a loud cracking sound echoed nearby. Part of a neighboring structure collapsed. You heard screaming immediately afterward. Your father rushed outside into the chaos, while your mother tried desperately to keep younger children calm. Rain poured through the doorway sideways beneath violent winds. The entire city sounded alive, with panic, shouting voices, barking dogs, thunder, collapsing wood, splashing water. After several terrifying minutes, your father returned soaked completely through. The old storage hut fell, he said breathlessly. Crushed 2 people. Nobody spoke. The storm continued for hours. You barely slept at all. And sometime near dawn, while listening to rainwater drip steadily from the leaking roof beside your mat, you realized something deeply unsettling. Cahokia was not merely uncomfortable anymore. It was beginning to feel fragile. By sunrise, the storm had finally crawled away from Cahokia, leaving the city soaked, muddy, and exhausted. Gray clouds still hung low above the river valley, while cold mist drifted between the houses. Everywhere you looked, people were repairing something. Collapsed walls, broken roofs, flooded storage pits, damaged fences. The city seemed held together by constant emergency labor now, as though every storm peeled away another layer of stability. Your father returned from inspecting the damaged neighborhood with a grim expression. The 2 people killed during the night had been an elderly man and his granddaughter trapped beneath falling beams inside the collapsed storage structure. Their relatives were already preparing burial arrangements before the heat worsened the smell of death. Nobody stopped working for funerals in Cahokia. The living still needed food. You stepped carefully through ankle-deep mud toward the communal well area, carrying clay jars for water. The pathway looked worse than ever after the storm. Waste floated in puddles beside scattered animal bones and rotting vegetation. Children splashed barefoot through filthy runoff, while exhausted mothers shouted useless warnings after them. Near the water source, tempers were already rising. Too many people had arrived at once. One woman accused another family of taking more than their share. Voices sharpened immediately. Everyone's nerves felt stretched thin lately. Hunger, exhaustion, overcrowding, and fear made even simple tasks dangerous. Before the argument became physical, several older residents separated the women while muttering complaints about how crowded the district had become. You filled the jars as quickly as possible. The water looked cloudy. That worried you. After major storms, contamination spread easily through the city. Floodwater carried waste into storage pits and drinking sources alike. Sickness often followed within days. People understood the connection, even if they didn't fully grasp why it happened. As you carried the jars home, a strange smell drifted across the neighborhood. Rot, not ordinary garbage or river mud. Something worse. Near the edge of the district, several dead fish had washed inland after the flooding and now lay baking beneath the warming sun. Flies swarmed thickly around them. A nearby elder spat into the mud and declared it a bad omen from the river spirits. Lately, every unpleasant thing became an omen. At home, your mother immediately boiled the water before anyone drank it. Fuel wood was becoming harder to gather, but sickness frightened her more than shortages. While the water heated, your aunt quietly spoke about another troubling rumor spreading through the city. Several farming villages south of Cahokia had supposedly stopped sending expected grain shipments. Nobody knew whether floods destroyed the crops or if the villages themselves were struggling too badly to spare supplies. Either possibility felt dangerous. The city depended completely on surrounding farmland. Without constant deliveries, tens of thousands of mouths could not survive. Your father listened silently before leaving for another labor assignment near the central plaza. This time, you stayed behind to help repair storm damage around the house. Wet clay had peeled from sections of the walls, exposing woven cane beneath. If repairs waited too long, another heavy rain could weaken the entire structure. The work was miserable. Mud coated everything. Mosquitoes returned immediately after the stormwater settled. The humid air felt thick enough to drink. Even worse, the smell from nearby flooded areas intensified as the morning grew warmer. While repairing the rear wall, you noticed movement beyond the neighboring houses. More newcomers, another group of migrants entering the district. They carried bundles, tools, sleeping mats, and frightened children. Their clothing looked worn and muddy from long travel. One older woman limped badly while leaning on a carved wooden stick. Your aunt watched them uneasily. More displaced families, she murmured. Nobody celebrated their arrival. Years earlier, new people meant new trade, new skills, new opportunities. Now each arriving group represented more pressure on food and space, already stretched dangerously thin. One young migrant man approached nearby households, politely asking whether unused shelters existed in the district. Nobody answered quickly. Families avoided eye contact. Taking strangers inside could create risk. Theft had increased lately. Fights over food happened more often. Trust between neighbors weakened as conditions worsened. Eventually, someone directed the newcomers toward overcrowded housing near the outer edge of the city. Your aunt sighed quietly after they left. They look half-starved already. Around midday, drums sounded again from the ceremonial center. Different this time. Slow, heavy, funeral drums. People paused instinctively while the sound echoed across Cahokia. Somewhere beyond the houses, priests were conducting burial rites for the storm victims. Smoke from ceremonial fires rose above the central mound district into the gray sky. Death ceremonies in Cahokia could be elaborate depending on status. Powerful elites received impressive burials with ornaments, offerings, and sacred rituals. Ordinary people often disappeared quietly into graves with little ceremony beyond family mourning. Life here had hierarchy, even after death. Later in the afternoon, your father returned unexpectedly early. That alone felt alarming. Labor crews were dismissed because an important gathering had been announced near the plaza. Word spread rapidly through the neighborhoods until crowds slowly moved toward the ceremonial district, despite lingering mud and humid heat. You followed cautiously beside your family. The closer you approached the central mound, the stranger the atmosphere became. Guards stood along major pathways, watching the crowds carefully. Priests carrying feathered staffs moved between smoking fire pits. Thousands of people gathered across the open plaza, while dark clouds drifted overhead again. Then the rulers appeared. From a distance, they looked magnificent, decorated cloaks, shell ornaments, painted faces, towering ceremonial garments. Elevated platforms made them seem almost superhuman above the muddy, exhausted masses below. One priest began speaking loudly about spiritual imbalance threatening the city. Another declared the storms and poor harvests were signs that the people must restore harmony through obedience, sacrifice, and labor. Murmurs spread quietly through the crowd. You noticed many listeners exchanging uncertain glances. The speech continued for a long time. The leaders promised the gods still favored Cahokia, but more ceremonies would soon be required. Additional construction projects near sacred areas would begin immediately. Workers from every district must contribute. That announcement landed badly. People were already exhausted. You could almost feel the frustration spreading silently through the crowd, like heat before lightning. Your father stared toward the platform without expression. Beside you, an older laborer muttered under his breath, "More dirt, more walls, more mounds, always more." Fortunately, the drums drowned out his words. Then something unsettling happened. Several prisoners were brought forward into the plaza. Their hands were bound. Nobody explained clearly who they were. Criminals, perhaps. Captives from rival communities, maybe. The crowd shifted uneasily as priests surrounded the prisoners with smoke and chanting. You had witnessed ceremonies before, but never this close. One prisoner looked terrified beyond words. Another stared blankly at the ground, as though already dead inside. Your younger brother grabbed your arm tightly. The chanting intensified. Priests raised ceremonial blades toward the darkening sky. Then your mother forced your family away before you could see more. Nobody spoke during the walk home. Nobody needed to. That night, the city felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, fearful. Rain clouds blocked the moon completely, while distant ceremonial fires flickered red above the mound district. Somewhere far away, drums continued echoing through the darkness, long after most families retreated indoors. Your household ate dinner in near silence. The food portions looked smaller again. Your mother tried hiding it by adding extra water to the maize stew, but everyone noticed. Afterward, your father finally whispered the thought many feared, saying aloud, "The rulers are afraid." The words settled heavily inside the room, because if the elite leadership truly feared losing control, then life inside Cahokia could become far worse very quickly. Outside, wind rustled through wet reeds, surrounding the neighborhood. Dogs barked nervously somewhere beyond the houses. A baby cried in the distance. Nearby, someone coughed violently without stopping. You lay awake, staring into darkness, long after the others slept. And for the first time in your life, the great city no longer felt eternal. It felt like something enormous and wounded, trying desperately not to collapse. The following days inside Cahokia became strangely tense, as though the entire city was holding its breath. People still worked, traded, cooked, argued, and hauled baskets through the mud. But beneath every ordinary activity lurked nervous anticipation. The ceremony in the plaza had unsettled everyone. Nobody openly discussed what happened to the prisoners afterward, yet whispers drifted through every district. Some claimed the captives had been executed before dawn. Others insisted they were buried beneath a sacred structure as offerings to calm angry spirits. A few people swore the rulers planned even larger sacrifices if the floods and crop failures continued. In crowded cities, rumors multiplied faster than flies around spoiled meat. You woke before sunrise to the familiar chorus of coughing, barking dogs, crying infants, and dripping water leaking through damaged roofs. The storm-soaked ground still hadn't fully dried. Each step outside produced a wet, sucking sound beneath your feet. Smoke from hundreds of cooking fires mixed with river fog, until the entire neighborhood smelled like damp ash and stale fish. Your mother handed you a smaller breakfast than usual. Just maize porridge again. No beans this time. No fish. The bowl looked depressingly thin. Nobody complained aloud, but the silence around the meal said enough. Food anxiety had become part of daily life now. Families quietly measured portions. Storage baskets were checked repeatedly. Every rumor about failing harvests spread panic through the city. After eating, you joined a labor crew assigned to reinforce one of the wooden palisade walls surrounding parts of the settlement. The rulers had ordered expanded defensive work immediately after the recent ceremonies. Officially, the projects honored spiritual obligations and protected the city. Unofficially, many suspected the elites feared unrest. The walk toward the outer districts revealed how enormous Cahokia truly was. Houses stretched endlessly across the muddy landscape, interrupted by workshops, storage areas, shrines, and crowded lanes full of people carrying goods or tools. Yet, despite its greatness, signs of decay appeared everywhere now. Collapsed fences remained unrepaired. Garbage piles grew larger. Drainage ditches overflowed. Sick people sat outside homes, too weak to work. One elderly woman leaned against a wall, coughing so violently you thought she might die right there in the street. Nobody stopped. They couldn't afford to. The labor site itself was chaotic. Hundreds of workers hauled logs, sharpened stakes, and packed earth into defensive embankments, while supervisors shouted instructions constantly. Sweat-drenched everyone within minutes despite the early hour. Humidity pressed against your skin like wet cloth. Nearby, two workers quietly discussed families leaving the city. That caught your attention immediately. Leave Cahokia. For years, the settlement had attracted newcomers from every direction. The idea of people willingly abandoning the greatest city many had ever seen felt almost impossible. But apparently, some households already had. According to the workers, several farming families slipped away during the night after deciding life inside the overcrowded city had become unbearable. Taxes, labor demands, poor harvests, disease, and fear pushed them beyond endurance. One laborer snorted bitterly. The rulers think bigger mounds solve everything. The other glanced around nervously before whispering, "Careful." Fear lingered everywhere now. By midday, the heat became suffocating. Workers paused repeatedly to wipe sweat from their eyes, while insects swarmed around exposed skin. Several people developed nosebleeds from exhaustion and dehydration. The city's wells remained muddy after the floods, and some drinking water carried a strange, unpleasant taste lately. Then someone collapsed. A young man working beside the timber stacks suddenly dropped face first into the mud without warning. At first, everyone assumed heat exhaustion, but when workers rolled him over, panic spread immediately. Dark spots covered parts of his skin. Blood stained the corner of his mouth. The labor supervisor ordered people backward instantly. Nobody touched the man again. Disease terrified Cahokia more than storms or hunger, because illness moved invisibly through crowded populations. Entire neighborhoods sometimes became infected before anyone realized danger existed. The unconscious worker eventually regained partial awareness, but his breathing sounded terrible, wet, ragged, desperate. Guards carried him away toward an isolated shelter near the outer district, while whispers spread rapidly through the labor crews. By afternoon, many workers kept distance from one another instinctively. Every cough suddenly sounded threatening. Every fever became suspicious. You returned home exhausted and filthy, only to discover another unpleasant surprise waiting there. Your aunt was sick, not severely yet, but enough to frighten everyone. She sat wrapped in blankets despite the humid heat, sweating heavily while complaining of chills and stomach pain. Your mother boiled herbs near the fire, while your father paced silently near the doorway. Nobody said the word disease aloud. Superstition clung tightly to sickness in Cahokia. Some blamed evil spirits. Others believed certain illnesses spread from spiritual impurity or divine punishment. Regardless of the cause, fear often mattered more than understanding. Your younger brother refused to sit near your aunt during dinner. Truthfully, you avoided it too. That evening, while darkness settled across the city, another strange sound echoed from the ceremonial district. Not drums this time. flutes, slow, eerie music drifting through the humid night air. You stepped outside briefly and noticed unusual activity near the central mound. Firelight flickered across large gathering areas, while priests moved in long ceremonial lines, carrying torches. Another ritual, your father muttered, but his expression looked troubled. The rulers seemed increasingly desperate to reassure the population, or perhaps themselves, that the gods still protected Cahokia. Ceremonies grew more frequent. Public gatherings became more dramatic. Sacrifices, according to rumor, had increased, yet conditions inside the city continued worsening anyway. Later that night, your aunt's fever intensified. She began mumbling incoherently during sleep. Your mother wiped cool water across her forehead while whispering prayers. The rest of the household remained awake, listening anxiously to her breathing. Outside, rain started falling lightly again. Not a violent storm this time, just steady dripping rain tapping against the roof, while distant ritual music floated through darkness. Hours passed, then suddenly your aunt sat upright with a gasp, so sharp it startled everyone awake. Her eyes looked unfocused. Terrified, she pointed weakly toward the wall. "There are people outside," she whispered. Your father checked immediately. Nobody was there. Still, the moment unsettled the entire household. Fever dreams frightened people deeply. Many believed the sick could glimpse spirits or warnings invisible to healthy eyes. Near dawn, your aunt finally fell into exhausted sleep. Your mother looked equally exhausted herself by then. Nobody else rested much. Morning arrived gray and damp once again, and with it came terrible news, spreading rapidly through the district. Several more laborers from yesterday's work, crews, had become violently ill overnight. One was already dead. Fear swept through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. People avoided touching strangers. Families boiled water obsessively. Some households burned herbs or hung protective charms beside doorways. Others rushed toward priests seeking blessings near the ceremonial district. The city suddenly felt smaller, more crowded, more dangerous. You accompanied your father toward the market later that morning, hopping to trade for medicine herbs. But the atmosphere there felt completely changed. Traders spoke quietly. Buyers kept distance whenever someone coughed. A few stalls stood abandoned entirely because their owners were reportedly sick. Near one corner of the market, a heated argument erupted between villagers and city guards. The villagers wanted permission to leave Cahokia temporarily until the sickness passed. The guards refused. Nobody shouted openly about it, but the meaning felt obvious enough. The rulers feared people abandoning the city. Your father pulled you away before the argument worsened. On the walk home, you noticed smoke rising from several isolated areas beyond the residential districts. Fires for purification rituals, or perhaps funeral pyres. In Cahokia lately, it became harder and harder to tell the difference between the two. That evening, your aunt's fever finally broke slightly, though she remained terribly weak. Your mother looked relieved enough to cry quietly while preparing another thin meal beside the fire. But outside, beyond your fragile clay walls, the great city sounded increasingly restless. More arguments, more crying, more ritual drums beginning again beneath the dark sky, and somewhere far away near the towering mounds, the rulers of Cahokia were preparing something large enough that workers had already begun clearing enormous sections of the plaza for whatever came next. The next morning, the air over Cahokia felt strangely cold despite the season. Fog rolled heavily across the ground, swallowing the lower parts of houses and drifting between the giant mounds like pale smoke from another world. Normally, the city woke gradually with shouting traders, barking dogs, and workers hauling tools through muddy lanes. But today many people remained indoors longer than usual. Too many were sick. Too many were afraid. Your aunt still lay weak beside the wall, wrapped in blankets damp from sweat. Her fever had lowered slightly, yet she looked frighteningly thin already. Your mother barely slept during the night while tending to her. Every few hours, she boiled herbs or heated water, hoping the illness would not spread through the rest of the household. Your father quietly inspected the food storage baskets near dawn. Not much remained. You could see it in his face immediately. He tried hiding the concern, but the truth sat openly inside the nearly empty containers. The city's shortages were no longer distant rumors from farming villages. Hunger had entered the neighborhoods themselves. Breakfast consisted of watered maize paste with almost no flavor at all. Even your younger brother, usually quick to complain, stayed silent while eating. Outside, the fog muffled sounds across the district. People moved like shadows through the gray air carrying bundles, water jars, or firewood. Smoke from cooking fires hung low near the ground, mixing with the damp smell of mud and sickness. Then the drums began again. Deep, slow, deliberate. Everyone paused instinctively. The sound rolled outward from the ceremonial district near the great mound, echoing across the fog-covered city like a giant heartbeat. Your father stared toward the hidden outline of the central plaza. "They're preparing something," he murmured. Nobody needed to ask who. They meant. Soon messengers moved through the neighborhoods, announcing that all labor crews must gather near the ceremonial center before midday. Important spiritual rites would take place to restore balance and secure the city's future. Attendance was expected. Expected meant mandatory. So despite exhaustion, fear, and sickness, crowds slowly began flowing toward the center of Cahokia. You joined your family, moving through muddy streets, crowded with thousands of others. The fog gradually lifted as the morning warmed, revealing the enormous scale of the settlement once more, and the misery of it. Garbage heaps rotted beside pathways. Floodwater still stagnated in low areas, buzzing with insects. Thin dogs wandered hungrily between houses, searching for scraps. Several people, visibly sick, sat outside their homes, too weak to stand. One old man coughed blood directly into the mud, while passers-by carefully avoided getting too close. The closer you approached the ceremonial district, the tighter security became. Guards carrying heavy wooden clubs lined major entrances into the plaza. Priests burned herbs and incense beside large fires, sending strange, sweet smoke into the humid air. Then you saw the construction. A massive wooden platform had been erected near the base of the central mound. Freshly built, huge enough for the entire crowd to see clearly. Your stomach tightened immediately. So did everyone else. Nobody spoke loudly, but nervous whispers spread through the gathering masses. The rulers had summoned nearly the entire city for this. Tens of thousands of people crowded together beneath the looming earthen pyramids, while drums pounded steadily overhead. The elite leaders emerged near midday. Painted faces, shell ornaments, towering feathered garments. From a distance, they appeared almost unreal, standing high above the muddy, exhausted population below. Priests raised ceremonial staffs toward the sky, while chanting echoed across the plaza. One leader stepped forward and addressed the crowd. He spoke about disorder spreading through the world. Floods, disease, weak harvests, conflict. He claimed spiritual harmony had been broken and demanded restoration through obedience, sacrifice, and unity beneath Cahokia's sacred authority. Many listened silently. Some looked frightened. Others looked angry. Your father kept his expression carefully blank. Then the prisoners appeared. More than before. At least a dozen. Their hands were bound behind them with rope. Some looked like outsiders captured from distant communities. Others appeared terrifyingly ordinary, frightened young men and women from nearby regions, perhaps accused of crimes, rebellion, or sacrilege. The crowd shifted uneasily. Even the air seemed heavier suddenly. Your younger brother clung tightly to your mother's arm, while priests circled the prisoners, chanting louder and louder. Smoke drifted upward around the platform as drums intensified into a relentless thunder. Then one prisoner tried to run. It happened so quickly, the crowd gasped aloud. A young captive broke free and sprinted toward the edge of the plaza in blind terror before guards tackled him violently into the mud. The entire gathering erupted into shouting and confusion for several moments. The prisoner screamed desperately while struggling beneath the guards. Wait, you would remember that scream for the rest of your life, because it sounded deeply human, not ceremonial, not symbolic, just terrified. The guards dragged him back onto the platform, while priests continued chanting as though nothing unusual happened. Some people in the crowd lowered their eyes. Others stared in frozen silence. Your father leaned towards you quietly. "Do not watch," he whispered. But you did. Everyone did. The ceremonies continued beneath the blazing afternoon heat, while thousands stood sweating in packed silence. You never saw every detail clearly from the crowd, yet enough became horrifyingly obvious. Blood darkened the wooden platform. The drums never stopped. Neither did the chanting. By the time the rituals finally ended, the atmosphere across Cahokia had changed completely. Fear no longer lingered quietly beneath daily life. Now it stood openly in the streets. People dispersed from the plaza in near silence. Even children barely spoke during the long walks home. The city felt stunned, as though everyone had witnessed something they desperately wished to forget, but never could. That evening, no music drifted from the neighborhoods. No laughter, no storytelling beside fires. Only quiet conversations behind thin reed walls, and distant ceremonial drums echoing long after sunset. Your aunt, still weak from illness, asked softly what happened at the plaza. Nobody answered directly. Your mother simply told her to rest. Dinner portions shrank again that night. The maize stew contained more water than grain now. Hunger gnawed constantly at everyone, yet fear had become stronger than hunger. Outside, rain clouds gathered once more beyond the river valley. Your father sat near the doorway, sharpening a tool silently, for a very long time before finally speaking. The rulers think fear will hold the city together. Your mother glanced nervously toward the walls. "Keep your voice low." But he continued anyway. "People are leaving already. More sickness spreads every week. The crops are failing. And now this." He shook his head slowly. "A frightened city becomes dangerous." Nobody argued, because deep down everyone knew he was right. Later that night, strong winds swept across Cahokia ahead of another approaching storm. Roofs creaked. Fires flickered wildly. Somewhere nearby, a child cried uncontrollably, while adults tried soothing them. You stepped outside briefly before sleeping. From the edge of the district, the great mound still towered above everything, beneath flashes of distant lightning. Ceremonial fires burned near its summit, like glowing eyes watching over the dark city. Once those mounds represented power and greatness to you. Now they felt oppressive, heavy, like giant earthen reminders of how much suffering had been demanded from ordinary people to build them. Thunder rolled across the horizon again, and for the first time, you found yourself wondering whether the gods had abandoned Cahokia long ago, or whether they had never been listening at all. The storm arrived after midnight with violent winds that rattled every wall in Cahokia like loose bones. Rain hammered the roofs so hard it sounded as though thousands of hands were beating against the city at once. Lightning flashed constantly above the giant mounds, turning the night white for brief, terrifying moments before plunging everything back into darkness. Nobody in your house slept properly. Your younger brother whimpered each time thunder cracked overhead. Your aunt remained weak from illness, breathing unevenly beneath her blankets, while your mother whispered prayers beside the fire. Water leaked steadily through new cracks in the roof despite yesterday's repairs. Then the river horns sounded. Long, low blasts echoed across the storm. Your father froze immediately. Flood warning. Within moments, shouting erupted through the neighborhood outside. Doors slammed open. People ran through the rain carrying bundles, tools, children, anything they could grab quickly. The Mississippi had always been both lifeblood and nightmare for Cahokia. During severe storms, the river could rise frighteningly fast, swallowing farmland, destroying storage areas, and turning entire districts into mud-filled disaster zones. "Move," your father shouted. Everyone scrambled into action. Food baskets were lifted onto higher shelves. Sleeping mats rolled tightly together. Water jars secured with rope. Outside, rainwater already rushed through the pathways like small rivers carrying debris, and animal waste downhill toward the lower districts. Another horn blast sounded. Closer now, your family joined the growing stream of people hurrying toward slightly higher ground near the inner districts. Mud sucked at your feet with every step. Wind drove cold rain sideways across your face hard enough to sting. Somewhere nearby, a roof collapsed with a loud cracking noise, followed instantly by screams. The city had become terrifying at night during storms. Without moonlight or proper roads, chaos spread quickly. People stumbled through darkness carrying crying children, while guards shouted conflicting instructions near flooded pathways. Dogs barked wildly. Fires hissed and died beneath the rain as your family struggled uphill through the muddy streets. You noticed something shocking. The outer neighborhoods were already flooding. Water swirled between houses carrying baskets, broken wood, and floating debris. Several smaller structures leaned dangerously as floodwater undermined their foundations. Families trapped inside shouted desperately for help from rooftops and elevated platforms. And still, the rain continued pouring. By dawn, the worst of the storm finally weakened. But Cahokia looked devastated. Gray water covered large sections of the lower districts. Mud coated everything. Dead chickens and broken household items floated through shallow flood currents. Entire storage sheds had collapsed overnight. Worst of all, one of the grain storehouses near the riverbanks had been destroyed. That news spread panic almost immediately. People gathered in tense clusters, discussing the damage, while guards attempted to keep order near the flooded areas. Your father returned briefly after inspecting the situation himself. "The grain is ruined," he said quietly. Nobody replied. Everyone understood what that meant. The city's food situation had already been worsening before the flood. Losing stored grain now could become catastrophic Once colder months arrived. As morning dragged onward, another grim reality emerged. Bodies, floods always uncovered death. Workers moving through damaged neighborhoods found several drowned residents trapped beneath collapsed walls or washed into drainage channels during the night. Some were elderly. Some were children. One family reportedly lost 3 members after water swept through their house while they slept. The funeral drums began again before midday. At this point, the sound no longer surprised anyone. You spent most of the afternoon helping clear mud from nearby pathways alongside exhausted neighbors. The work felt endless. Every shovel of mud revealed more underneath. Mosquitoes already returned in thick swarms around standing water, despite the cooler air after the storm. Nearby, 2 women argued fiercely over spoiled food supplies. One accused the other of stealing dried maize during the evacuation. The argument escalated rapidly until relatives pulled them apart before violence erupted. This happened more and more now. Fear was changing people. By late afternoon, the rulers finally sent officials into the flooded districts, distributing limited emergency grain from protected reserves. But the amount each household received looked pitifully small compared to the scale of the disaster. Still, the distribution created another problem. Crowds, thousands gathered, desperately hopping for food. Guards struggled maintaining order, while exhausted residents pushed forward carrying bowls, baskets, or anything capable of holding grain. The atmosphere became dangerously tense beneath the humid evening sky. Your father waited with you near the back of one line, stretching through the muddy plaza between damaged houses. People whispered angrily around you. They keep plenty hidden for themselves. We build their mounds while our children starve. The gods clearly abandoned this place. Quiet fool. A fight broke out near the front after one man accused a guard of giving extra grain to relatives. The guard struck him hard enough to send him sprawling into the mud. Suddenly, several people surged forward shouting at once. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though the crowd might riot. More guards rushed in, immediately carrying clubs. The tension broke apart slowly, but the fear remained hanging over everyone afterward. When your family finally received its ration, the amount barely filled half a basket. Your mother stared at it silently during the walk home. That night, dinner portions became smaller than ever before. Your younger brother asked whether there would be enough food for winter. Nobody answered him. Outside, the city smelled terrible after the flood. Rotting vegetation, mud, smoke, waste, and stagnant water mixed into a thick, humid odor drifting through every district. Insects swarmed relentlessly around standing pools left by the storm. Then the sickness worsened. Word spread after dark that entire households near the lower flooded districts had become violently ill. Fever, vomiting, coughing, weakness. Some blamed contaminated water. Others insisted angry spirits from the river had entered the city. Your aunt began coughing again during the night. Your mother looked terrified. The next morning brought no relief. Thin gray sunlight revealed just how damaged parts of Cahokia truly were now. Sections of farmland outside the city remained underwater. Workers reported dead fish floating along river edges by the hundreds. Several wells had become unusable from contamination. And then another rumor spread, this one colder than the others. Some families had begun secretly burying food, not for ceremonies, not for winter storage, to hide it from desperate neighbors. Trust inside the city was disappearing. You accompanied your father later, that morning, toward one of the damaged outer districts, helping transport repair wood. Along the way, you passed groups of migrants preparing to leave Cahokia entirely. Their belongings were tied into bundles carried across shoulders or loaded onto crude sleds. A woman carrying an infant glanced back toward the giant mounds with open hatred before continuing northward. Nobody tried stopping them anymore. Perhaps the rulers realized they couldn't. Near the flooded district, the destruction looked horrifying up close. Houses leaned sideways from water damage. Mud buried entire sections of pathways. The smell of death lingered everywhere beneath the damp air. Then you noticed workers digging several graves together near the edge of the neighborhood. Too many graves. One laborer muttered quietly that they had stopped giving proper individual ceremonies because there simply wasn't enough time. Your stomach turned cold. Not long ago, Cahokia felt eternal. Now parts of it resembled a dying animal too large to save. As evening approached, dark birds circled above the flooded riverbanks, while workers burned piles of ruined grain and contaminated supplies. Smoke drifted across the city beneath a blood-red sunset, reflecting off stagnant floodwater. Your father stood silently, watching the distant mounds. Finally, he spoke. This city grew too fast. The words sounded painfully small against the vastness of Cahokia stretching around you. Yet deep inside, you knew he was right, because the greatness of the city had always depended on endless labor, endless food, endless obedience, endless growth. And now all those things were beginning to run out at the same time. For several days after the flood, Cahokia existed beneath a gray curtain of exhaustion. The city still moved, but slowly now, like a wounded beast dragging itself through mud. Smoke rose constantly from fires burning ruined grain, soaked wood, and contaminated debris. The air tasted bitter every morning, and everywhere people looked thinner. Your family rationed food carefully. Meals had become small enough that nobody truly felt full anymore. Your mother scraped every cooking pot clean while pretending not to notice your younger brother staring hungrily at empty bowls after dinner. The floodwater in the lower districts receded gradually, leaving behind thick black mud that smelled rotten beneath the warming sun. Workers spent entire days clearing pathways and recovering usable materials from collapsed homes. Sometimes they found bodies buried beneath the wreckage days after the storm ended. The funeral drums no longer stopped. At dawn, they echoed from one district, by afternoon from another, by nightfall from somewhere else entirely. Death had become part of the city's background noise. One morning, your father returned from labor duty with troubling news. The rulers were demanding another major construction effort near the ceremonial center, despite the flooding and food shortages. More terraces, more reinforced walls, more sacred platforms to restore harmony. People reacted badly, very badly. Even those normally loyal to the leadership began muttering openly now. Ordinary workers were exhausted, hungry, sick, and frightened. The idea of hauling more dirt beneath brutal heat while families struggled to survive felt unbearable. Still, refusing labor orders remained dangerous. So the work continued. You joined a crew carrying packed clay toward a newly expanded platform near the central mound. The city looked strangely different during the walk there. More abandoned houses appeared across certain neighborhoods. Entire families had quietly disappeared overnight, leaving behind empty structures slowly collapsing into mud. No one chased them anymore. Perhaps too many had already gone. At the work site, the atmosphere felt tense from the beginning. Supervisors barked instructions harshly, while laborers moved with dull, exhausted expressions. Nobody joked. Nobody sang work songs anymore. The only constant sounds were shovels scraping dirt, heavy breathing, and distant coughing. The heat returned fiercely by midday. Humidity wrapped around the workers like wet cloth, while insects swarmed thickly above the churned earth. Sweat ran constantly into your eyes. The clay baskets cut painfully into shoulders, already rubbed raw from previous labor. Then a man near the front of the work line suddenly threw down his basket. Everyone froze. He was older, thin from hunger, his face hollow with exhaustion. "I won't do this anymore," he shouted. The words shocked the entire labor crew into silence. Nobody spoke to overseers that way. The man pointed toward the giant mound, towering above the city. "My children are starving, while they build more dirt hills for spirits that never answer." Several workers lowered their eyes immediately. Others stared openly. The supervisors moved toward him at once. At first, they ordered him back to work, but the man refused again, louder this time. Anger poured from him like floodwater breaking through a dam. He shouted about spoiled grain, sickness, dead neighbors, endless labor, and rulers hiding behind ceremonies while ordinary families suffered. For one dangerous moment, nobody moved, because many workers agreed with him. You could feel it. Then the guards arrived. The beating happened quickly and brutally. Clubs struck the man repeatedly, until he collapsed into the mud, bleeding from the face. Workers nearby flinched at every impact, but remained frozen in terrified silence. Finally, the guards dragged the barely conscious laborer away, while the supervisors ordered everyone back to work immediately. Nobody spoke afterward. The only sound was shovels moving through dirt beneath the suffocating heat. But something had changed. Fear still ruled the city, yet now anger was growing beside it. That evening, your father warned everyone inside the house to avoid political conversations entirely. People disappear now, he whispered. Your aunt, still weak but improving slowly, stared toward the fire. They always disappeared, she said softly. We just notice it more now. Outside, heavy clouds gathered once again over the river valley. The weather itself seemed determined to punish Cahokia endlessly. That night, another problem struck the neighborhood. Rats, at first only a few, appeared near storage areas, searching for grain, after the floods destroyed easier food sources. But within days, they seemed everywhere, darting through shadows, chewing baskets, fighting beneath floors, climbing through damaged walls. Your younger brother woke screaming after one ran across his sleeping mat in darkness. The rats terrified people almost as much as disease. They spoiled food, spread filth, and multiplied rapidly in crowded districts where waste piled high after the flooding. Cats were rare in Cahokia, and dogs could not control the infestation. Your mother began hanging food baskets from roof beams whenever possible. Even then, scratching noises filled the walls at night. Several evenings later, while returning from water collection, you noticed unusual activity near the market district. Crowds gathered around traveling traders, arguing loudly with local guards. Apparently, certain merchants planned leaving the city before conditions worsened further, but officials were attempting to restrict large grain exports. Tempers exploded quickly. One trader accused the rulers of trapping people inside a dying city. A guard struck him hard across the mouth. The crowd reacted instantly with angry shouting. You slipped away before violence fully erupted, but the tension spreading through Cahokia felt undeniable now. Trust between rulers and citizens was collapsing like flood-damaged walls. That same night, your father made a decision. He waited until the younger children slept before speaking quietly near the fire. We may need to leave before winter. The words stunned the room. Leave Cahokia. The idea still felt almost impossible despite everything happening around you. This city had dominated the world your entire life. The great mounds, crowded markets, endless labor crews, ceremonies, and river trade defined existence itself. Your mother looked frightened immediately. Go where? She asked. Your father hesitated. North perhaps, smaller villages, somewhere less crowded. Your aunt gave a tired, bitter laugh. And thousands of others won't think the same. Nobody answered her, because she was probably right. if large numbers fled the city at once, nearby settlements could quickly become overwhelmed too. Still, the thought lingered heavily afterward. For the first time, your family was seriously imagining life beyond Cahokia. Outside, wind rustled through the dark, wet reeds surrounding the district. Somewhere in the distance, ritual drums echoed faintly from the ceremonial center once again, but fewer people attended the ceremonies now. You noticed that the plazas no longer filled as completely as before. Some residents avoided gatherings entirely unless forced. Others simply lacked energy after endless labor and food shortages. Even belief itself seemed exhausted. Several days later, another disturbing discovery spread through the city. Someone had vandalized part of a sacred marker near the mound district during the night. Not accidental damage this time. Deliberate destruction. Guards searched neighborhoods aggressively afterward, questioning residents and inspecting houses. Fear returned immediately. Nobody wanted suspicion falling upon their family. Your father buried several carved symbols near the house entrance that evening. Hopping protective signs might keep trouble away. The city no longer felt merely miserable. Now it felt unstable, dangerous, like a massive structure, cracking apart from pressures too great to contain. And above everything loomed the giant mounds themselves, monuments built to display eternal power. Now watching silently over a population, growing weaker, hungrier, and more desperate with every passing week. Autumn finally began creeping across Cahokia, though the change brought little comfort. The summer humidity weakened slightly, but cooler air only revealed new problems waiting beneath the heat all along. The flooded districts dried into cracked fields of black mud that smelled foul whenever the wind shifted. Mosquitoes became fewer, yet sickness still lingered stubbornly through the neighborhoods. And now hunger was becoming impossible to ignore. People's faces looked thinner everywhere you walked. Children cried more often during the evenings. Market stalls, once crowded with fish, beans, squash, and grain, now displayed pitiful amounts of food guarded carefully by nervous traders. Prices climbed constantly. Arguments became common. The city felt stretched beyond its limits. One morning, your mother sent you to trade a carved bone tool for dried maize near the market district. The journey itself showed how much Cahokia had changed in only a few months. Entire rows of houses stood abandoned now, their walls slowly collapsing inward from rain and neglect. Dogs roamed through empty doorways, searching for scraps. Wind rattled loose reed panels against broken frames. You passed a family preparing to leave the city entirely. Again, that no longer shocked anyone. The father carried tools across his back, while the mother tied bundles onto a crude wooden sled. Two small children walked silently beside them, looking exhausted before the journey even began. An older woman from your district watched them depart and muttered, "They'll starve on the roads." Maybe she believed it, or maybe she simply envied their courage. At the market, tension hung over everything like smoke. Traders argued fiercely with buyers over tiny amounts of grain. Guards patrolled constantly now, watching for theft or unrest. Several stalls stood empty because their owners had either fled or died during recent sickness outbreaks. You finally reached a grain cellar, surrounded by desperate customers. The amount of maize your carved tool earned would once have been considered insulting. Now it barely seemed enough. While waiting near the stall, you overheard alarming conversation between two traveling traders recently arrived from smaller river settlements. According to them, some villages outside Cahokia had stopped recognizing the authority of the city's rulers altogether. Labor demands were ignored, grain shipments delayed or refused. Certain communities apparently blamed Cahokia itself for draining resources from surrounding lands. One trader snorted bitterly, "The great city eats everything." Nobody nearby argued, because deep down, many feared it was true. As you prepared to leave, shouting suddenly erupted near the far edge of the market. Another theft. A starving boy had tried stealing dried fish from a trader's basket. He couldn't have been older than 12. Guards grabbed him immediately while the crowd gathered around watching. The boy struggled desperately, screaming that his family had not eaten properly in days. One guard struck him hard enough to silence him instantly. The market went quiet, very quiet. For a terrible moment, you thought the crowd might turn violent again. Instead, people simply looked away. That somehow felt worse. You hurried home carrying the small grain bundle tightly against your chest. Along the pathways, workers dismantled sections of damaged structures to salvage usable wood. Cahokia had once constantly expanded outward. Now parts of the city were being stripped apart just to maintain what remained. At home, your father listened grimly to the market rumors. "The villages are pulling away," he said quietly. Your mother stirred thin stew over the fire without looking up. Can you blame them? Nobody answered. That afternoon, another labor summons arrived. This time, the workers were ordered to help strengthen food storage areas before winter fully arrived. The rulers clearly understood the danger now. If supplies failed during colder months, the city could descend into catastrophe. You joined hundreds of exhausted laborers, hauling clay and timber near the central districts. The atmosphere felt colder than before despite the crowded worksite. People spoke less openly now after recent arrests and beatings. Suspicion moved through the city like another disease. Still, whispers continued. Some claimed elite storehouses remained full, while ordinary citizens rationed scraps. Others believed the priests were planning enormous ceremonies before winter in hopes of restoring authority through fear. A few whispered about rebellion, That word terrified everyone most. Near sunset, while carrying timber beside the outer edge of the ceremonial plaza, you noticed something deeply unsettling. The giant mounds looked damaged, not collapsing exactly, but worn. Rain erosion scarred certain slopes. Wooden retaining structures required constant repair. Grass patches had died across some surfaces, leaving exposed earth beneath. For the first time, the monuments themselves appeared tired, like the city no longer possessed enough strength to maintain its own symbols of greatness properly. An older worker beside you noticed your stare. They said these mounds would last forever, he muttered. Then he laughed softly, not happily. That night, cold rain returned again. Not violent storms anymore, just endless, miserable drizzle soaking the city day after day. Roofs leaked constantly. Clothing never fully dried. Smoke from indoor fires clung heavily inside houses, making eyes burn through the evenings. Your aunt's cough returned with the damp weather. So did your father's. The sicknesses never truly left Cahokia now. They simply moved from household to household like wandering spirits. Several days later, another grim announcement spread through the districts. Additional labor taxes. Every family must contribute more workers or resources toward emergency winter preparations near the Mound district. People reacted with exhausted disbelief. Some households barely possessed enough strength to survive daily life already, but refusal remained dangerous. That evening, your father finally admitted what he had been secretly planning. He had spoken with several other families, considering departure before winter trapped everyone inside the failing city. The room fell silent. Your younger brother looked frightened immediately. Leave forever. Maybe, your father said quietly. Your mother stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. This was supposed to be the safest place. That sentence lingered heavily afterward, because Cahokia had promised security once. Protection, power, opportunity. Instead, it had become overcrowded, hungry, sick, violent, and increasingly unstable beneath leaders who answered every problem with more labor and more ceremonies. Outside, cold wind rattled the walls, while distant drums echoed faintly from the ceremonial district. Yet again, fewer people cared anymore. You could sense it. The rituals no longer inspired the way they once had. Hunger weakened faith faster than argument ever could. Late that night, unable to sleep, you stepped outside briefly beneath the cold drizzle. The city stretched endlessly into darkness around you. Thousands of houses, thousands of struggling people, smoke drifting low across muddy lanes, coughing from nearby homes, bobbies crying, dogs fighting somewhere beyond sight, and above all of it, the great mound rising against the storm clouds like the shadow of something ancient already beginning to fade. Then you noticed movement along the outer pathway. another family leaving. Even at night, they moved quietly carrying bundles beneath blankets while trying not to attract attention. The smallest child looked back toward the city one final time before disappearing into darkness beside the others. You watched until they vanished completely, and for the first time in your life, the thought of escaping Cahokia no longer felt impossible. It felt necessary. The cold arrived earlier than expected that year in Cahokia. Not deep winter cold yet, but sharp river winds that crept through cracked walls and made damp clothing cling unpleasantly to the skin. Morning frost appeared across abandoned rooftops, while thin ice formed along puddles in the outer districts before sunrise. For many families, the season felt terrifying. Food supplies already looked dangerously low. Your household now ate only twice each day. The portions had become so small that hunger remained constant, like an ache living permanently beneath the ribs. Your younger brother had stopped complaining entirely. That frightened your mother more than tears ever could. People moved differently now too. Slower, wearier. The city's energy had drained away. Even the market district sounded quieter than before. Traders guarded supplies carefully, while buyers argued desperately over handfuls of grain or dried fish. More stalls stood empty every week. Entire sections of the marketplace looked abandoned beneath the cold gray sky. One morning, your father took you with him toward the northern edge of the city, where several families secretly planned to meet after dark. He still hadn't fully decided whether your household would leave Cahokia, but the discussions were becoming serious now. The walk revealed another ugly truth about the city. Crime was worsening. Near one narrow pathway, a crowd gathered around a badly beaten man lying half-conscious in the mud. Someone had attacked him during the night and stolen his food bundle. Nobody seemed particularly shocked anymore. Hunger changes people quickly. Desperation makes cruelty easier. Your father pulled you away before guards arrived. "Keep your eyes down," he muttered. That had become his advice for nearly everything lately. At the northern district, you found several workers dismantling abandoned houses for firewood. Nobody bothered preserving empty structures anymore. Survival mattered more than appearances. Broken beams, roof panels, even woven walls were stripped apart and carried away. An older woman nearby whispered bitterly, "The city is eating itself now." Again, nobody disagreed. Later that afternoon, another ceremony was announced near the central mound. The rulers seemed obsessed with rituals lately. Every flood, every sickness outbreak, every food shortage brought more chanting, more fires, more processions. Yet conditions continued worsening anyway. Many residents attended only because guards expected visible participation. Your family went reluctantly. The plaza looked smaller than before despite the enormous crowds. Perhaps because fear and exhaustion pressed so heavily upon everyone. Wind swept cold dust across the open gathering spaces, while priests prepared ceremonial fires near the giant platform. The rulers appeared dressed magnificently once again, but something had changed. Even from a distance, they looked strained, tired. The city's elite could still wear shell ornaments and feathered cloaks, but they could not hide reality completely anymore. Food shortages affected everyone eventually. So did sickness. So did fear. The ceremony focused heavily on unity and obedience. Priests spoke about loyalty to Cahokia during difficult times. They warned that abandoning the city would anger sacred powers, protecting the people. That part drew quiet murmurs from the crowd. Too many families had already left. Everyone knew it. Then another announcement came. Additional grain contributions would be required from surrounding farming villages before winter. The reaction was immediate. Not loud rebellion, not open shouting, something colder. You could feel resentment spreading silently through the crowd like freezing water, because people understood what that meant. The rulers were becoming desperate. After the ceremony ended, your father guided the family quickly away from the plaza before the crowds thickened too heavily. Along the muddy pathways, conversations buzzed quietly all around you. They demand more because the storehouses are emptier than they admit. The villages will refuse. They can't feed this many people anymore. That last sentence lingered in your mind long after returning home, because deep inside, everyone knew it was true. Cahokia had become too large, too dependent, too fragile. That evening, while cold rain tapped against the roof, your father finally revealed the full plan. Several families intended leaving within the next moon cycle, before winter roads became impassable. They would travel north towards smaller settlements, less burdened by massive populations and elite labor demands. Your mother looked terrified. "The roads are dangerous," she whispered. "Yes," your father admitted. "And if smaller villages reject outsiders?" He hesitated. "Then we keep moving." Silence filled the room afterward, except for the sound of rain dripping steadily into a clay bowl placed beneath another roof leak. Your aunt stared into the fire for a long time before speaking softly. "I remember when people dreamed of reaching Cahokia. Nobody answered her, because now people dreamed of escaping it instead." Over the following days, preparations quietly began. Not openly. That would attract attention. Families leaving the city often departed secretly now, especially if they still owed labor service or grain taxes. Guards had become increasingly suspicious about nighttime movement through certain districts. Your father hid dried food whenever possible. Tools were repaired quietly after dark. Your mother stitched travel bundles from old cloth while pretending merely to patch household items. Meanwhile, the city itself continued deteriorating around you. More sickness spread through the lower districts after contaminated wells froze partially during cold nights. Funeral drums echoed constantly again. Several storage structures collapsed beneath water damage and neglect. Theft became so common that many families now slept beside their remaining food. One particularly cold morning, you accompanied your father toward the riverbanks, gathering salvage wood after another abandoned dock structure partially collapsed. The river looked terrifying beneath winter skis. Dark, cold, endless. Chunks of debris drifted slowly through the gray water, while dead reeds rattled in the wind along muddy shorelines. Several fishermen worked silently nearby with almost no success. Then you noticed something strange farther downstream. A line of people leaving, not just one family this time. Dozens, men, women, children carrying bundles and tools while moving northward along the river paths away from Cahokia. Some pushed crude sleds loaded with possessions. Others carried infants wrapped tightly against the cold wind. Nobody spoke much. They simply walked. Your father watched them silently for a very long time. Finally, he said, "We waited too long." Those words chilled you more than the wind, because your father had always believed the city would recover somehow. Even after floods, sickness, hunger, and violence, part of him still trusted Cahokia's greatness. Now even that belief was dying. That night, the cold deepened further. Smoke from thousands of fires drifted low across the city, trapped beneath heavy clouds. Coughing echoed through nearby houses constantly. Somewhere, a child cried for food, until the sound slowly faded into exhausted silence. You lay awake, listening to the city around you. Not the proud, powerful city from childhood stories. Not the sacred center of the world the rulers described during ceremonies. Just a crowded place full of frightened, hungry people trying desperately to survive another winter. And outside, beyond the darkness, more families were already slipping away into the cold one by one, leaving the great mounds behind like abandoned dreams, sinking slowly into mud. Winter tightened its grip fully over Cahokia, and with it came a silence that felt unnatural for such a massive settlement. Not true silence, of course. Cahokia never truly stopped sounding alive, but the usual rhythm had changed. Fewer footsteps in the streets, fewer arguments at the market, fewer children playing outside. Even the dogs seemed quieter, moving hungrily through the cold mud with lowered heads. Smoke hung constantly in the air now, trapped beneath heavy clouds. Every household burned fires for warmth, but firewood was becoming harder to find. Many families had already stripped nearby structures bare. The forests beyond the city had grown thin from years of consumption. What remained was farther away, harder to reach, and increasingly controlled by competing groups. Your household had started sleeping closer together for warmth. At night, your aunt's breathing still sounded weak, but but stable enough to survive. Her illness had not worsened, though it also had not truly left her. In Cahokia, recovery felt less like healing and more like temporary pause between problems. Food had become the city's sharpest pain. Even basic maize was now carefully rationed everywhere. Your mother divided each portion with almost ceremonial precision, as though small differences in quantity might decide survival itself. Your younger brother no longer asked for more. He simply ate quietly and waited. Your father spent most mornings outside now, meeting other families in secret. Plans were forming, not just for your household anymore. For many, you had begun noticing it more clearly during trips through different districts. Small groups gathering briefly in hidden corners, speaking quietly, then dispersing quickly when others approached. Cahokia was still enormous, still politically controlled, still outwardly structured. But beneath that surface, something else was forming. Separation, movement away. One morning, your father returned earlier than expected with an expression that immediately tightened the air inside the house. "We leave in 3 nights," he said. No long explanation followed. No debate, just the decision. Your mother froze for a moment before slowly nodding. Fear was still there, but so was resignation. Staying no longer felt safer than leaving. The preparation that followed was careful and quiet. Nothing could look suspicious. People still watched each other closely in the city. Guards still patrolled certain routes. Even neighbors could unknowingly expose intentions if they became too curious. Your family packed only what could be carried without difficulty. A small amount of dried maize, a few tools, blankets, simple containers for water. Everything else was left behind. That realization hit hardest at night. How little of an entire life could actually be taken forward. Outside, snow began falling lightly for the first time that season. It wasn't heavy yet, but enough to cover mud in a thin white layer that melted quickly under footsteps. The world felt quieter beneath it. On the second night before departure, you walked briefly outside alone. The city looked different under snow, familiar yet distant. The great mounds still rose above everything, but now they appeared less like symbols of strength and more like silent shapes watching over an exhausted population. Smoke drifted from countless small fires between houses, glowing faintly orange against the cold air. Somewhere far in the distance, drums echoed again, but even those sounded weaker now, as if the city itself was tiring of its own voice. You passed a nearly empty street where several houses stood abandoned. Doors hung slightly open. Walls sagged inward from neglect. No one had repaired them because the people who once lived there were gone. This sight was becoming normal, too normal. On your way back, you saw something that stayed with you. A group of children standing near a frozen puddle, staring at their reflection in the ice. were not playing, not laughing, just watching themselves in silence, as if trying to understand something they couldn't yet name. Hunger had changed, even childhood. The final night before leaving came without ceremony. No one slept properly. Your father stayed awake most of the night, listening for sounds outside. Your mother checked bundles repeatedly, ensuring nothing had been forgotten. Your aunt, though still weak, insisted on walking without assistance if she could manage it. Before dawn, the house felt strangely empty despite everyone still being inside it. Then, just before the first light, your father gave the signal. No words, just a nod. You stepped outside into freezing air. The city was still dark. Most fires had burned low. Most people were asleep. The streets were quieter than you had ever known them. For a moment, you wondered if anyone would stop you, but no one did. You moved through familiar paths one last time, carrying everything you owned in your hands and on your back. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from memory. As you reached the edge of the district, you looked back. Cahokia stretched behind you in the cold dawnlight, vast, layered, silent in a way it had never been before. The mounds rose in the distance like frozen shadows. Smoke drifted slowly upward from scattered fires. And somewhere deep within that enormous city, life continued, but without you now. Your father placed a hand briefly on your shoulder. "Don't look too long," he said softly. And then you turned forward, toward the cold path beyond the city, toward whatever came next. The first hours after leaving Cahokia felt unreal, as if the world itself had not yet decided whether to release you. The ground beyond the city was frozen in uneven patches, a mixture of brittle frost and hard mud that cracked beneath every step. Your breath came out in pale clouds, quickly swallowed by the gray air. Behind you, the city slowly disappeared into distance. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually fading into mist, smoke, and winter haze. At first, you could still see the tallest mounds rising above the horizon like dark silhouettes. Then they blurred. Then they became shapes. Then nothing distinct remained at all, just a heavy presence in your memory, and the knowledge that thousands of people still lived there, continuing the same exhausting cycle you had just escaped. Your father led the group carefully along less traveled paths north of the river. Others had joined your household during the night, 2 neighboring families who had made the same decision. Together, you moved in a quiet line, avoiding main routes and watching for signs of guards or patrols. No one spoke much. Conversation felt dangerous in the open landscape. The countryside outside Cahokia was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Familiar because you had traveled parts of it before for wood and labor. Unfamiliar because now it felt empty in a way the city never did. Even in winter, there should have been hunters, traders, small village smoke columns in the distance. Instead, there was only silence, and wind, and snow beginning again in light drifting flakes. By midday, the group stopped near a sheltered grove of bare trees. Your father allowed a brief rest. Everyone sat carefully on frozen ground, pulling blankets tighter around their shoulders. Food was distributed sparingly, just enough to keep strength from fatting completely. One of the other men spoke quietly for the first time. "They will notice we are gone soon." Your father nodded. Yes. No one asked what would happen after that, because everyone already knew the answer. Back inside the city, disappearance meant investigation. Investigation meant guards. Guards meant questions, punishment, or worse. But leaving meant survival risks, too cold, hunger, exposure, uncertainty. It was not an escape. It was a trade. Later that afternoon, you crossed a shallow frozen stream. Ice cracked beneath boots, revealing dark water underneath that looked deeper than expected. Someone almost slipped, but was pulled back quickly. The group moved faster after that. As evening approached, the landscape changed slightly. Trees became denser, wind less direct. The path narrowed into something more like a natural corridor through winter forest. That was when you saw the first abandoned fire pit, a small circle of stones, ash still faintly visible beneath snow, footprints nearby, already fatting. Your father crouched beside it briefly. "Not long ago," he said. The group grew quieter after that. They were not alone on these routes. Others had come this way before, and likely more would follow. Night came early. You built a small hidden fire under thick branches, careful not to let smoke rise too high. Everyone gathered close for warmth. The forest around you felt alive in a different way than the city, less human, more indifferent. Branches creaked above. Distant animals moved through darkness. Snow fell gently through gaps in the canopy. Your aunt slept for the first time without coughing. That alone felt like a small miracle. But your father did not sleep much. He stayed awake listening, always listening, as though expecting pursuit. In the middle of the night, you woke to him speaking quietly with one of the other men. "If they track us," the man whispered, "we won't be able to outrun them in snow." Your father answered calmly, "They won't send many. Too many people are already leaving." That was the first time you understood something important. Cahokia was still powerful, still large, still structured, but it was beginning to strain under its own weight. Controlling everyone was no longer as simple as before. Too many families were slipping away quietly. Too many districts were too exhausted to enforce obedience strictly. The next morning, you continued north. Each step took you farther from the city's influence and deeper into unfamiliar land. By midday, the group reached a ridge overlooking a wide stretch of forest and river valley. From there, you could no longer see Cahokia at all. It was gone completely, behind distance and trees. Your mother stood still, for a long time at the edge of the ridge. Then she spoke softly. "It feels like it never existed." Your father replied, without looking back. "It did, and that was all." You descended into the forest on the other side. The world ahead was quieter, colder, less controlled, but also, for the first time in a long time, not suffocating. Behind you, the great city remained still alive, still struggling, still massive beneath winter skis, but no longer part of your immediate world. And ahead of you, the unknown began. Days passed slowly after leaving the reach of Cahokia, and the world ahead began to feel less like escape and more like endurance. The forest deepened around you, trees growing thicker, paths less certain, and the silence heavier in its own way than the crowded noise you had left behind. Snow no longer fell gently. It arrived in sharper bursts now, driven by cold wind that cut through clothing and skin alike. Every morning began with the same routine: wake in near darkness, break down the small camp, move before the cold settled too deeply into bones, then search for any sign of a safer path or distant settlement. Food was becoming the real enemy. What you carried from the city was already shrinking fast. Each portion had to be carefully divided. Your mother watched every serving closely, as if measuring not just hunger, but time itself. No one wasted anything anymore, not even crumbs. Your aunt, though still weak, was walking again. Slowly, carefully, but she was moving. That alone felt like a fragile victory. Your father rarely spoke unless necessary. He led the group with quiet certainty, reading the land more than the sky. Sometimes he would stop, look at distant tree lines, and adjust direction without explanation. People trusted him now because there was nothing else to trust. On the 5th day, you found remnants of another group. Not a fire this time. A trail, footprints layered over older footprints, leading north along the river's curve. Some were recent. Some were fatting. It became clear you were not alone on this path. Many others had made the same decision to leave Cahokia behind. The realization brought mixed feelings: relief, fear, and something harder to name: confirmation that the city was not the only one breaking. By midday, the group reached a wider clearing where the forest opened slightly. There, you found something unexpected: a small abandoned shelter made of bent branches and woven reeds. Inside were signs of temporary habitation ashes, broken tools, scraps of dried food, long gone cold. Your father examined it carefully. "Recent," he said. One of the other men looked uneasy. They left in a hurry. No one disagreed. That night, your camp was set farther away from the clearing. Fire was kept smaller than usual. Everyone spoke in whispers. The forest felt less empty now, not with danger exactly, but with awareness. You were moving through a world other people were also trying to survive. Sleep came unevenly. Somewhere in the night, you woke to distant howling wind, or perhaps something else moving through trees. It was impossible to tell. Your eyes adjusted to darkness slowly, but nothing clear emerged. Still, you stayed awake longer after that. The next day brought change. The terrain shifted. The forest thinned gradually, opening into rolling land broken by frozen grass and scattered tree clusters. The river reappeared more clearly in the distance, wider now, slower in parts, where ice gathered along the edges. Your father stopped near a rise in the ground and pointed ahead. There, he said. At first, you saw nothing. Then slowly, shapes emerged. Smoke, not the endless industrial haze of Cahokia, but thin rising columns from smaller hearth fires. A settlement, not large, not powerful, but alive. The group did not rush. They watched first. From a distance, you could see people moving between simple shelters, far fewer than what you had left behind. No massive mounds rose here. No ceremonial platforms dominated the landscape. Only practical structures, built for survival rather than display. One of the other families whispered nervously, "Will they accept us?" Your father did not answer immediately. Then he said, "We will find out." As you approached, the settlement noticed you. Movement slowed. People gathered cautiously near their shelters, watching your group with guarded expressions. Not hostility exactly, but uncertainty. Everyone here understood the weight of strangers. New mouths meant new pressure on already limited resources. Your father stepped forward, alone first. He spoke calmly, offering simple words, no demands, no claims, only request for shelter through winter and willingness to work. Silence followed, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then an older man from the settlement stepped forward. He studied your group carefully. His eyes lingered on the children, on your aunt, on the tired faces of everyone who had walked too far already. Finally, he nodded once. "You can stay," he said, "but you work. No ceremony, no grand welcome, just agreement, practical, immediate." That night, you sat near a small fire inside the new settlement's boundary. It felt different from Cahokia fires. Smaller, quieter, less crowded. The air itself seemed lighter, even in cold. Your mother exhaled slowly beside you. Your aunt rested without coughing again. Your father stared into the flames for a long time, saying nothing. Far behind you, beyond forests and rivers, and distance that now felt unreal, the great city still existed, large, struggling, and slowly changing under pressure. It could no longer fully control, but it no longer defined your world. Ahead was uncertainty, but also space to breathe. And for the first time in a long while, survival did not feel like something happening inside a collapsing giant. Winter in the new settlement felt different from everything you had known inside Cahokia. It was still cold, still harsh, still demanding in ways that shaped every waking hour. But it was not crushing in the same way. The air was open here. The space between people felt wider. Even silence seemed less heavy. The settlement itself was small, built close to the river on slightly elevated ground. Shelters were simple, wood frames covered with bark, reed bundles, and animal hides. No towering structures. No ceremonial platforms dominating the horizon. No endless lines of workers being driven from one construction site to another. Only life, reduced to its most necessary form. Work began immediately for your family. There was no long discussion about staying. Survival required contribution. Men were sent to cut firewood from the forest edges. Women helped with food preparation, weaving, and maintaining shared storage. Children gathered smaller branches and carried water from the river under supervision. Your father worked longer hours than ever, but he seemed steadier now, less burdened by invisible pressure. There were no overseers shouting orders, no forced labor quotas, no sacred monuments demanding constant expansion. Work here had a purpose people could understand directly: warmth, food, shelter. Your mother adjusted quickly to the rhythm of the settlement. Her hands were always busy, but her expression slowly softened over time. Even your aunt, still recovering from months of illness, began to regain strength more steadily than she ever did inside the city. The difference was not instant, but it was real. At night, families gathered around shared fires. Stories were told again, not about fear or warnings or ceremonies, but about travel, whether hunting, distant places along the river. People listened without constant tension in their shoulders. Children sometimes even laughed quietly. That sound felt unfamiliar to you at first, almost strange. One evening, while collecting firewood near the riverbank, you walked farther than usual. The water flowed slowly under thin layers of ice near the edges, reflecting pale winter sky. The world felt wide in a way you had not experienced before. You stopped and looked back. The settlement was behind you, small clusters of smoke rising gently into the cold air. No mounds, no towering symbols of authority, no overwhelming crowd, just scattered life holding itself together through cooperation instead of pressure. For a moment, your thoughts drifted backward, not with longing exactly, more with distance. You remembered the endless noise of Cahokia, the crowded paths, the constant labor, the ceremonies under heavy drums, the floods, the hunger, the fear that had slowly become normal. You remembered how large it had seemed, how permanent it felt, how impossible it once appeared to leave. And yet you had left, not in a moment of victory, but in exhaustion. Later that night, your father sat beside the fire longer than usual. Most others had already gone to sleep. Only the sound of wind through bare branches filled the gaps between silence. He spoke quietly, without looking at anyone. "I used to think the city would last forever," he said. No one interrupted him. I thought size meant strength. He paused, then added, but things that grow too fast forget what they need to survive. Your mother stirred the fire gently, but said nothing. The words lingered in the cold air. Outside, snow began falling again, slow, light, almost peaceful. It covered the settlement softly instead of violently. There was no fear in it, only weather. You watched the flakes disappear into the flames for a long time. Somewhere far beyond forests and rivers, and distance too great to see, the great city still stood, still struggling, still alive in ways you could no longer witness directly. But it was no longer the center of your world. It had become something else, a memory, a warning. And as you finally lay down that night beneath a simple shelter, surrounded not by thousands, but by a few sleeping families sharing the same fragile warmth, you understood something you could not have understood before leaving. Survival was not always about building something bigger. Sometimes it was about stepping far enough away to see what had been breaking all along.